Once a story told in fear, now humanity commands the battlefield. Before I tell you what happened at Korath Station, I need you to understand something. I have filed 214 incident reports in my career. I have documented fleet engagements, diplomatic breakdowns, 3 separate first contact protocols gone sideways, and 1 incident involving a Vethkai ambassador and a malfunctioning gravity plate that I am still not legally permitted to describe. I have written every one of those reports in the precise, clinical language my superiors expect from a tactical liaison officer of the Shaleth Dominion. I do not know how to write this one. What I witnessed at Korath did not fit inside language I was trained to use. It did not fit inside any category I had studied. There is a word in Shaleth Veltharis which roughly translates as the moment a calculation proves itself wrong while you are still inside it. We use it for equipment failure. For structural collapse. For the precise, terrible instant when a model you trusted with your life tells you something that cannot be true, and is. I used it in my personal log 17 times in 4 days. The humans were not supposed to be there. They were not supposed to survive the opening engagement. They were not supposed to hold the Eastern Corridor, regroup after losing their communications array, and I want to be very clear about this, they were absolutely not supposed to win. The Shaleth tactical doctrine I was trained on classified humanity as a Tier 3 military presence. Capable. Occasionally resourceful. Statistically outmatched against any Dominion allied force operating above garrison strength. I believe this. I had the simulations. I had the casualty projections. I had 17 years of field reports that all said the same thing in slightly different words. Then, I met Sergeant Adeyemi. And I started keeping a second log. An unofficial one. The kind you're not supposed to keep. The kind that doesn't get filed with the fleet, doesn't go through review, doesn't get sanitized for the eyes of my commanding officer. This is that log. I'm releasing it now because the war is over and because what happened at Korath Station needs to be on record somewhere that isn't buried under 17 layers of Dominion classification protocol. Not for the humans. They know what they did. They were there. For everyone else. For every species in this galaxy that has a file on humanity that ends with the word manageable. Update your files. Once a story told in fear, now humanity commands the battlefield. Part 1. The thing about manageable, the first shell hit while I was still arguing with the docking clamps. This is relevant only because it means I was standing in the wrong part of the station when everything began, and because it means the first human I saw in a combat situation was not a soldier at a post or a commander at a console. It was a figure sprinting past me in the smoke-choked junction corridor of Korath's lower ring, moving at a speed that my threat assessment implant had not flagged as biologically possible for a Tier 3 species, carrying another human across both shoulders. The second shell hit while I was still processing the first. I should tell you about myself. My name is Tactical Liaison Officer Selhareth Van Duvain, and I was assigned to Korath Station as an observer. Dominion intelligence had flagged the station as a potential flashpoint. The Vrath Combine had been pressing into this sector for 11 months, and Korath sat directly across their most probable expansion vector. My job was to watch, assess, and report. I was not a combatant. I had not been in a live-fire engagement since my 4th year of training. I had a sidearm I had not discharged in 8 years and a personal habit of eating a cold protein meal every 3 hours whether I was hungry or not, which my colleague Assessor Druvian found disgusting and which I found essential for maintaining the kind of steady cognitive function that good reporting requires. I mentioned the protein meal because I had been in the middle of one when the Vrath opened fire. There were 41 humans on Korath when the attack began. I had read their assignment briefs. A security detail, 12 soldiers. A technical team, 9 engineers. A medical unit, 6 personnel. The rest were a mixture of administrative staff, a xenosociologist named Ferreira who had been studying Dominion human cultural friction points for her university, and 1 soldier whose assignment read only attached special operations with a name beneath it, Adeyemi, K. Sergeant First Class. I had not paid particular attention to the special operations attachment when I read the files. I paid a great deal of attention to it later. The Vrath attack was not a raid. I want to be clear about that because the early Dominion reports called it one, and whoever wrote those reports was either working from incomplete data or was lying to make the outcome look less catastrophic. 3 Wrath assault cruisers, 2 troop carriers, and a signal suppression platform. They had not come to probe. They had come to hold. Koratha's garrison was 112 Dominion soldiers, plus the 41 humans. Wrath landing forces numbered, by my later count, somewhere between 400 and 500. The signal suppression platform went active 12 seconds after the first shell hit. After that, nothing in or out. No fleet communication. No distress signal. No data uplink. Just me, my personal log recorder, my cold protein meal dissolving in my stomach, and the increasingly loud sounds of a station coming apart. I did not find a shelter. This was not bravery. I want to be honest, I was too disoriented to make a good decision and I moved in the wrong direction, which happened to be toward the sounds of shooting rather than away from them. By the time I understood my mistake, I was in the lower ring junction corridor, and retreat was no longer straightforward, and the human with 2 bodies across its shoulders had already passed me. I followed. I do not fully know why. The protein meal hypothesis again, stable cognition produces poor choices in chaotic environments. I have since revised this theory. The human did not notice me for approximately 40 seconds. I later learned, though the distinction was not immediately legible to me given the full tactical armor had set the 2 bodies down behind a collapsed section of corridor wall, was checking both of them with rapid, practiced movements of her hands, and was simultaneously speaking in a low voice into a communicator that was almost certainly not receiving or transmitting anything. The signal suppression platform was fleet grade. It blocked everything. She was talking anyway. Oh, say, I've got you. Kowalski, stay with me. I've got you both. Her voice was completely level. The communicator crackled static. She kept talking. You're going to be fine. I'm getting you somewhere stable and, then, I'm coming back. One of the bodies, Osei, I would learn made a sound that no species with functional survival instincts would want to hear coming from a crewmate's chest. The human's hands did not stop moving. She found a medical pack on her own belt, applied something to Osei's side with a pressure that would have made my secondary cartilage ache to witness, and said, still at that same flat, functional volume, I know. I know. You're good. Breathe. I was standing approximately 3 body lengths away from all of this. The human had not looked at me. I was not certain she knew I was there. My threat assessment implant had finally generated a profile on her, 1.73 meters, mass consistent with light to medium augmentation, elevated metabolic output, heart rate, and here the implant had paused, which it was not designed to do, heart rate elevated but within operational range. She had just carried 2 bodies at a sprint through a shelled corridor. Her heart rate was within operational range. I must have made a sound. A shift in my breathing, perhaps, or the faint resonance click my secondary jaw produces when I am experiencing what Shalath physiologists classify as acute situational recalibration. She looked up. Her face was, I am going to use the clinical language here because the clinical language is the only thing that holds the memory in a manageable shape. Her face showed damage. A cut above the left eye, already clotting. A bruise spreading under the right orbital ridge. She had clearly been in contact with something structural and dense in the recent past. The eyes themselves were brown, forward set in the way that always unnerved me slightly about human faces, and they assessed me in approximately the time it takes for my species to blink once. She said, "Your Dominion liaison." I read your brief. You armed? I have a sidearm, I said. I am not a combatant. That's fine. She turned back to Osei. Can you shoot in a direction I point you? I thought about this. Probably. Good enough. She stood. Her left leg was bleeding. I had not noticed the leg before. There was a tear in the armor at the thigh, and the dark stain had spread to the knee. She did not look at it. She looked at the corridor ahead. There are 46 Wrath soldiers currently between us and the station's secondary operations hub, she said.
Defensive line is partially intact around the hub. If we can get Osei and Kowalski there, the medics can work.
46, I said.
46 confirmed. Maybe more.
She picked up her weapon, a human pattern kinetic rifle, heavily modified in ways that made my technical implant produce a small anxious notation about voided warranties, and checked it with the same automated efficiency she had used on Osei's wound.
There are 2 of us, I said. She glanced at me. Not dismissively. More like someone checking a measurement against a reference point. There are 2 of us right now, she said. Come on. This is the thing about Tier 3 assessments. They are built on aggregate data. Fleet engagements. Casualty ratios. Weapons comparisons.
They are not built on the specific, granular reality of following one particular human through a corridor with 46 Wrath soldiers in it, watching her move. She did not move like something that had been categorized as manageable. I do not have precise language for how she moved. My implant kept generating descriptors and abandoning them: evasive pattern, irregular, threat adaptive, non-standard, all of which were accurate and none of which captured what it actually looked like, which was, and I am aware this is not clinical language, like something that had decided the corridor belonged to it and was simply proceeding on that assumption and waiting for the environment to agree. The first Wrath contact came 60 seconds in. 2 soldiers at a cross junction, standard defensive posture, covering the main axis. She did not go down the main axis. She went up. There was a maintenance crawlspace overhead, the kind that Wrath soldiers never bother to cover because most species cannot navigate them at operational speed. She was through it in the time it took me to understand what she was doing, and she came out on the other side of the junction, behind them, and the 2 Wrath soldiers were no longer a factor before I had finished processing the option she had taken. She came back through the crawlspace. Your turn, she said.
I cannot. I looked at the crawlspace. My secondary skeletal structure does not. Main corridor, then.
Hug the left wall. There's a blind spot at the 3-meter mark.
Move. I moved. I did not question it.
This, in retrospect, is interesting to me. I had known this human for approximately 4 minutes and I was moving on her instructions without deliberation. My training covered this scenario: do not cede tactical control to unfamiliar personnel of uncertain capability. My training had apparently not covered the specific scenario where unfamiliar personnel of uncertain capability spoke in a tone that made deliberation feel like a very bad idea.
We acquired 2 more humans in the next 10 minutes.
A soldier named Nowak, who had been pinned behind a collapsed server bank with a fractured forearm and was holding it against his chest with his good hand and shooting with the same arm, which was not the fractured one but was still, by any assessment I could make, not an arm that should have been reliably operating a weapon. And a technician in Ferreira, the xenosociologist, who had somehow acquired a Wrath weapon she clearly did not know how to operate but was holding in a direction that implied serious intent. Ferreira, Adeyemi said, in the tone of someone who has said a name like this before. Where did you get that? It was on the floor, Ferreira said.
Do you know how to know? But it's pointed the right way. Adeyemi looked at Ferreira for a moment. Ferreira looked back.
Something passed between them that I could not decode with any of my cultural interpretation training.
Fine, Adeyemi said. Stay behind Nowak. Do not point it at us.
Obviously, said Ferreira, in a tone that suggested this instruction had been unnecessary. Nowak, for his part, had glanced at his fractured arm, then at me, then at Adeyemi, and said, "Who's the Dominion officer?"
Liaison. He's with us.
Cool. And Nowak had turned back to covering the corridor behind us, which was apparently the complete extent of his processing time for the addition of an alien non-combatant to the group. I filed this under anomalous behavior and kept moving.
The route Adeyemi chose was not the direct route.
The direct route, I later calculated, passed through 3 Wrath defensive positions and had, at the time we were moving, approximately a 4% survival probability for our group given our composition and armament. The route she chose was longer by 11 minutes and passed through a section of the station's environmental service infrastructure that smelled powerfully of the recycled atmosphere chemicals used in Koratha's lower-level scrubbers. A smell that, I should note, my species finds intensely unpleasant in a way that is slightly beyond mere discomfort. There is an evolutionary reason Shalleth avoid enclosed spaces with high chemical saturation, and it involves a predator from our homeworld that used similar compounds as a territorial marker, and it activates a response in my limbic analog that is not entirely rational.
I did not say anything about this.
I followed Adeyemi through the chemical-saturated crawlways and I did not make the clicking sound my secondary jaw wanted to make, and I filed the experience under operational discomfort, manageable, which was becoming a category I was using with increasing inaccuracy.
Halfway through the environmental service section, we stopped.
Adeyemi held up a closed fist universal halt signal, at least universal enough that I had recognized it from the human military manuals I'd reviewed before arriving at Korath, and went very still.
I could hear nothing.
My auditory implant was picking up the distant percussion of weapon fire, the structural groan of the station absorbing stress, the faint recycler hum.
Nothing proximate. Nothing threatening. Adeyemi's head was tilted slightly.
Her eyes were not scanning, they were closed.
I looked at Nowak.
He gave a small lateral movement of his head that I interpreted as wait. I waited. The chemical smell was very present.
I counted the bolts on the nearest service panel. 12.
The third from the left had a slight corrosion discoloration. The seventh was a newer replacement.
Adeyemi opened her eyes. 3. Ahead, branching left. They're waiting.
How do you? I stopped.
She was already moving.
Not forward, sideways, into a service alcove I had not identified as an alcove until she stepped into it, and she was pulling a panel from the wall with the calm efficiency of someone who had looked at this panel and decided it was removable regardless of what its installation specifications suggested.
It was removable.
Behind the panel was a conduit access route that did not appear on the station schematics I had been issued.
This either meant the schematics were incomplete or Adeyemi had information I did not have. How did you know that was there? I asked.
Koratha's lower ring was built on a Velith pattern frame, she said. They always put a secondary access behind the scrubber alcoves.
Same layout for 30 years. You have studied Koratha's construction history? She was already inside the conduit.
I read the station brief, she said, from inside the wall.
Come on.
I have a colleague, Assessor Druvianen, who would tell me that what I was experiencing was simply competence. Thorough preparation meeting his situation it had been prepared for.
Druvianen is very literal.
Druvianen also was not in that conduit, in the dark, following a human who had memorized the architectural history of a station she had been assigned to for 11 days, past 3 Vrath soldiers who never heard us, to emerge in a service corridor 30 meters behind the position that would have ended us. I pulled up the section of the station brief that covered construction history when we stopped to rest briefly in the corridor.
I had read this document.
It had 14 pages on Koratha's structural development, the Velith pattern frame, the secondary access provisions of the lower ring. It had been in my brief for 3 weeks.
I had not retained it.
It had not seemed like something I would need.
Adeyemi had retained it.
She had retained it and she had used it in a tunnel, in the dark, while bleeding from her thigh and managing 3 other personnel and navigating past an ambush, and the retention had not been the remarkable part. The remarkable part was that she had retained it as a tool, immediately usable, not a piece of information but a piece of the environment that she had already decided belonged to her.
The secondary operations hub came into view 23 minutes after Adeyemi and I first spoke.
We had covered what should have been an impossible route and we had done it without losing anyone, and as we came into the defensive perimeter and a Dominion soldier moved to challenge us, Adeyemi was already speaking, already giving the call sign, already scanning the room for the medical team, already locating Osei and Kowalski in her awareness even though they were still back in the junction corridor, and the first thing she said to the senior human officer present was not a report on what she had done but a request for a stretcher team. I have 2 critical in Junction 7 Alpha, she said. 1 chest, 1 leg, both stable but they need to move now. The officer, a lieutenant whose name I would later learn was Brennan, looked at her with the particular expression I was beginning to recognize as the human default for processing a situation that should not be the situation.
You came through the lower ring? Scrubber route. 11 minutes. There are 46 Wrath soldiers in the lower ring. 42 now, Adeyemi said. And, probably more coming. Stretcher team?
Brennan had the stretcher team moving before she finished the sentence. And Adeyemi had already turned away from him, already looking at the defensive layout of the hub, already beginning, I could see it in the set of her head, to calculate the next problem. I stood in the doorway of the secondary operations hub and I looked at the cold protein meal I had somehow continued to carry through the entire transit. I do not remember picking it up. I must have grabbed it by reflex when I stood up in the corridor, which says something about either the depth of my habits or the inadequacy of my crisis cognition, and the container was dented and the meal inside was no longer cold and I could not remember the last 3 minutes of the route we had taken. Nowak sat down on a supply crate and looked at his fractured arm with the expression of someone who has just remembered it exists. Ferreira was still holding the Wrath weapon. She had not fired it. She was examining it with what I can only describe as academic interest, turning it over, peering at the mechanism. Fascinating trigger geometry, she said, to no one in particular. You're a xenosociologist, I said. Yes, she said. I study alien cultures. That includes their weapons. She turned it over again. This is actually a very elegant design. The Wrath think about firing lines differently than most, please, said Nowak, from the supply crate, eyes closed, point it somewhere else while you do that. Obviously, said Ferreira. She pointed it at the floor. As I was saying. Somewhere in the outer station, a third round of weapon fire opened up and, then, cut off very abruptly. Adeyemi came back to the doorway. She stood next to me. She looked at the dented protein container in my hands with a brief, unreadable assessment. You should eat that, she said. We're going to need everyone functional. I am aware, I said. I was going to. She looked at the defensive positions around the hub. At the Dominion soldiers. At Brennan, who was updating a tactical display with what appeared to be a significant amount of red markers. At the 2 doors in and the 1 door out. Hub's defensible, she said, not to me, more to herself, in the tone of someone checking figures. For now. A pause. They're going to hit us in about 40 minutes when the outer elements finish sweeping the ring. How do you know 40 minutes? I asked. She glanced at me. Wrath Standard Sweep Doctrine. 11 months of field reports. The suppression platform's been active for, she checked something on her wrist, 22 minutes. They sweep and consolidate before they push on a defended position. They're consistent. A flat pause. That's useful. She walked away toward Brennan and the tactical display. I ate the protein meal. It was room temperature and had been dented during transit and tasted the way recycled atmosphere chemical scrubbers smell when you are passing through them in a service conduit while someone else makes decisions about your survival. I ate all of it. 41 minutes later, the Wrath hit the hub. I am going to tell you what I observed in those next 40 minutes, because what happened inside the hub before the assault is, I have come to believe, more important than the assault itself. More important than the tactics. More important than the outcome. In 40 minutes, with no communications, no fleet support, and an unknown number of hostile soldiers closing in from the outer ring, the humans in that hub did not panic. I want to be precise about what I mean by this, because it is not that they were calm. They were not calm. Nowak was pale and tight-jawed and kept glancing at his arm. Ferreira had stopped examining the Wrath weapon and was sitting against a wall with her knees to her chest and her eyes moving too fast across the room. 3 of the other soldiers were running repetitive equipment checks that had no operational purpose beyond occupying their hands. They were afraid. Every biological indicator my implant could read said they were afraid. They were doing all of their work anyway. There is a concept in Shaleth military doctrine, Beltharn, the separation of function from feeling. It is something we train for extensively. It is considered a high-order cognitive discipline. Our behavioral theorists write monographs about it. We have training programs that last years. These humans were doing it instinctively, in a room that smelled of ozone and blood, while waiting for something they could not stop.
Adeyemi moved through the hub like she was checking items off a list no one else could see. Ammunition redistributed.
Defensive positions adjusted, she moved 2 soldiers without explaining why, and they moved, and the reason became clear when she described the Wrath as most likely breach point, and both relocated soldiers were now covering it. She found a damaged sensor array, looked at it, looked at Ferreira, and said, "Can you make this work?"
"I study alien cultures," Ferreira said.
"You've been taking apart a Wrath weapon for 20 minutes.
A beat. What do you need it to do?" What she needed was a passive motion detector covering the corridor they couldn't otherwise see.
What Ferreira produced, 17 minutes later, using components from the Wrath weapon and the station's internal sensor array and a length of shielded conduit wire, was not exactly that. What Ferreira produced was something that detected thermal displacement in the corridor, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough, and when Adeyemi looked at it she said, "That'll work," in the same tone she had used in the tunnels, the tone that turned facts into territory.
"I recorded all of this. I have the log.
If any of this sounds like I am elevating ordinary competence into something more, I want you to go back and look at my entry timestamp on the protein meal notation and compare it to my entry timestamp on Ferreira's device.
17 minutes. Between I study alien cultures and a functional improvised sensor array. The Wrath hit us at minute 43. They hit hard.
They hit from the predicted breach point, and from a second point that no one had predicted, and for approximately 90 seconds the hub was very loud and very bright, and my threat assessment implant produced a probability readout that I did not look at because the numbers it was generating were the kind of numbers that are not useful to a non-combatant in a defended room.
Adeyemi was at the second breach point before I understood there was a second breach point.
She had not gone to the primary. She had been at the primary for the first 40 seconds. I watched her, could not stop watching her, the way she moved in the fire and the smoke with that same terrible assumption of ownership, and then she had pivoted, without receiving any communication, without any signal I could identify, and crossed the hub to the second breach. Later, when it was quiet, I asked her how she had known.
She thought about it.
Genuinely thought, the way people do when they're not used to being asked to explain things they do without thinking.
The primary breach was too easy, she said.
They had more than enough force to push through and they slowed down. When one thing gets easier, something else is getting harder somewhere you're not looking.
That is a doctrine?
She shrugged. The shrug was the most human gesture I had seen in 47 hours, and I had been surrounded by humans for all of them.
That's just how it works. The Wrath pulled back at minute 51. Reorganizing, I noted in my log. Not retreating. They had more numbers. They had more time. The signal suppression was still active.
This was, by any rational military calculus, a pause before a conclusion. Adeyemi stood at the secondary breach point and looked at the closed door, and I watched the back of her head, and there was nothing I could observe, nothing my implant could measure, that explained the quality of the silence around her.
Not calm. Not fear.
Something that did not fit either category, something my language had approximately the right shape for but the wrong weight.
The Wrath were going to come back. We both knew this.
She turned around and looked at me.
"How are you holding up?" she said. I had not been asked this. Not by Druvianen, not by Brennan, not by Nowak.
I was a Dominion liaison officer in a combat zone I was not assigned to be in, and I had been moving and observing and recording and not dying for the better part of 2 hours, and no one had asked.
My secondary jaw clicked. I stopped it. "I am functional," I said.
She looked at me for another moment. Then, she said, "There's a secondary exit from this hub. Service corridor, east wall, behind the coolant relay panel. It comes out 3 levels up, near the docking ring. If this goes bad, that's your route."
I had not found this exit. I had been in the hub for 40 minutes. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She had already turned away.
"Because you came through the scrubber tunnels without complaining," she said.
"That's worth something."
She walked back to the tactical display. I stood at the second breach point and I looked at the coolant relay panel on the east wall, and the panel had a small dent in the lower left corner and 6 standard fasteners and one that was slightly misaligned, and I looked at that misaligned fastener for quite a long time. The Vrath were regrouping. We had 41 humans and whatever I was. And Adeyemi was looking at the tactical display like it was a problem she had already started solving. Once a story told in fear, now humanity commands the battlefield. Part 2, the weight of manageable. They came back at hour 6. Not in one surge. That would have been simpler. That would have fit inside a doctrine I could name, could reference, could annotate against the Vrath tactical literature I had reviewed before my assignment. Instead, they came in a series of probes, small, sharp, testing the edges of our perimeter, and each probe was slightly different from the last, adjusting, learning, and each time our line held it was because Adeyemi had moved someone 30 seconds earlier, repositioned a firing angle, redirected a resource, and each time I watched this happen I thought about the Tier 3 assessment file in my implants reference library and felt something that I am going to describe as structural discomfort because the clinical language is still load-bearing here. Brennan commanded the hub. I want to be clear about this. He was the ranking human officer and he was giving orders, and those orders were, by any objective assessment, competent. He was managing the defense of the hub the way a trained officer manages a defensive position. He knew what he was doing. But Adeyemi was doing something else. Something adjacent to command that did not have a name in the Shalath tactical vocabulary I had been trained in. She was not giving competing orders. She was not undermining Brennan's authority. She was, and this is where the language starts to strain, filling in the spaces between the orders. The gaps. The 3-second intervals where command decisions are not being made and combat is still happening anyway. She was in those gaps constantly, continuously, like she had mapped them in advance and decided they were hers. Nowak fought for 4 hours with a fractured forearm. I know this because I was there. I know this because at the 4-hour mark, when there was a 20-minute lull and the medic came to properly splint and immobilize the arm, Nowak looked at the splint with something I could only categorize as inconvenience, the way my species might look at a suboptimal equipment allocation, not pain, not relief, just a minor operational variable being resolved, and said, "Is this going to slow down my reload?" The medic, a human named Debbie who had been working continuously since the first shell hit and whose hands had not shaken once in my observation, said, "Yes." Nowak thought about this. How much? Your arm is fractured in 2 places. How much slower? Debbie looked at him with the particular expression I was coming to recognize as the human face for "You are asking me a question I should not dignify with an answer," about half a second. Okay. Nowak flexed the splinted hand experimentally, winced in a way that suggested the wince was the full extent of the communication his body was getting about the pain, and went back to his position. I recorded this exchange. I have listened to the recording several times since. I keep trying to find the point where a rational cost-benefit analysis of the situation would produce Nowak's response, and I cannot find it, and I have concluded that the calculation was not a cost-benefit analysis in the way I understand that term. It was something else. Something that started with the fractured arm as a given rather than a variable, not "I am injured, what should I do?" but "I am injured, the work still needs doing, how do I adjust?" The distinction matters. I have thought about it for a long time. At the 5-hour mark, Adeyemi did something that I want to describe carefully because I recorded it at the time as anomalous behavior, low priority, and I have since concluded this categorization was wrong. The lull between probes was running long. 12 minutes. The Vrath were either repositioning or waiting for something, and the uncertainty was producing a specific kind of tension in the hub, not the clean, sharp tension of imminent action, which the humans handled without difficulty, but the grinding, unresolved tension of not knowing, which is harder to bear. I observed this in the room's sound profile: more movement, more equipment checking, lower end, more frequent vocalization between personnel. Adeyemi had been reviewing the tactical display. She stopped. She leaned back from the display in a way that suggested she had finished with it, or had taken from it everything it could currently give. She looked around the room. Then, she said, loudly enough for most of the hub to hear, "Kowalski, before this started, you were telling Nowak about the time you got lost in the Calypso belt." A pause.
From the back of the room, near the medical area where Kowalski was recovering from the leg wound, a voice said, "Yeah. Finish the story." Another pause. Longer. I could feel the room's attention shift.
"We're kind of in the middle of something," Kowalski said.
"They're repositioning. We've got 15 minutes. Adeyemi had picked up her weapon and was checking the mechanism with the same automated efficiency as always. Not looking at Kowalski. "Finish the story." A beat of silence.
"All right," Kowalski said. "So, we've been drifting for 6 days because Petrov was our navigator. He was brilliant, actually. When he wasn't being an idiot, Petrov had decided to save fuel by running the calculations by hand instead of through the NAV computer, which would have been fine except he'd had 3 drinks before doing it and had transposed 2 digits in the coordinate entry. Laughter.
Not much. Not loud.
But it moved through the room in a way I observed on my implant's ambient monitoring: a slight metabolic shift, a fractional drop in the elevated stress indicators, the recalibration of 12 bodies that had been running on sustained alert for 5 hours.
Kowalski told the story for 9 minutes.
It was, objectively speaking, not a particularly extraordinary story. It involved navigational incompetence, a malfunctioning distress beacon that kept signaling Morse code obscenities at a passing cargo freighter due to a firmware error, and a 6-day supply of emergency rations that Kowalski described as tasting the way he imagined regret would taste if regret were also somehow gritty. It was the funniest thing I had heard in 5 hours.
I did not laugh.
My species does not produce the specific vocalization that constitutes human laughter. But I noticed I was tracking the story's progression with something that I would, in a different context, describe as investment, and I noticed that when it ended with the freighter captain's response to the obscene distress beacon, which I will not reproduce here but which caused Nowak to make a sound like something collapsing in a controlled manner, I experienced a brief, irrational reluctance for it to be over.
Adeyemi had listened to all of it without looking up from what she was doing.
"When the laughter settled," she said, still not looking up, "Good.
Everyone eat something if you've got it. They're going to hit the east access point in about 4 minutes.
They hit the east access point in 3.5 minutes.
This is the thing I keep coming back to.
Not the tactical competence. I have reviewed enough military literature to understand that tactical competence, however impressive, is a quantifiable thing.
You can put a number on it. You can train for it.
You can assess it against known benchmarks and place it on a scale. What Adeyemi did in that 15-minute lull was not on any scale I had been trained to read. She had assessed, correctly, with what I can only describe as diagnostic precision, that her unit was experiencing not a tactical deficit but a human one. That what they needed in that moment was not more ammunition or better positioning but a specific kind of refueling that had nothing to do with calories. And she had administered it, precisely, in the form of a man in a medical bed telling a story about navigational incompetence and gritty regret-flavored rations, and then she had ended it exactly when it needed to end and redirected the room's attention to what came next without a single wasted word. I do not have a word for this in Shalif. The closest is Velfarnasa, which means approximately the management of one's own unit's interior states in preparation for external demands. It appears in our command manuals as an advanced leadership concept. It is covered in a 3-day seminar that officers attend in their 7th year of service.
Adeyemi had done it with a story about a drunk navigator and a malfunctioning distress beacon.
I noted this in my log under anomalous behavior and then deleted the low priority tag. The next 18 hours were, in the formal military sense, a siege.
The Vrath held the outer station. We held the hub. The signal suppression remained active. No fleet communication. No knowledge of what was happening beyond the walls of the secondary operations hub. The Vrath made 12 separate attempts to breach the perimeter.
They held a 2-to-1 numerical advantage at minimum. They had supply lines to their ships. We had what we had started with, minus expenditure. I am going to tell you about Hour 14. Not the tactics of Hour 14. The tactics of Hour 14 are in the official report, it's classified, but the structural elements are what you'd expect. Vrath push, human response, position held. The numbers are there if anyone ever declassifies the file. I want to tell you about the 14-hour mark because that is when Adeyemi sat down.
Not for tactical reasons. Not for a strategy consultation.
She sat down on the floor of the hub, her back against the wall near the coolant relay panel with the misaligned fastener, the one she had pointed out to me, my escape route, and she put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes.
I watched this from across the room.
I had been watching her for 14 hours. I was aware this was excessive observation for a tactical liaison's log, and I had been making a conscious effort to distribute my attention more evenly across the hub's personnel, but there was something about watching Adeyemi work that made the watching feel like data collection rather than fixation, which may have been a rationalization but was at least a functional one. Her leg wound had been properly dressed at the 4-hour mark. The cut above her eye had been closed with adhesive strips. She had eaten 3 times in 14 hours, I know this because I had been noting it, the same way I noted my own protein meal intervals, except that her intervals were more irregular and she ate while doing other things and never sat down to do it.
She sat down now.
Her face, in the moment when she closed her eyes, looked, I am going to note this precisely because I want the record to be accurate, like a piece of equipment that had been running above rated capacity for an extended period and had been permitted, briefly, to idle.
Not broken. Not failing.
Just running a diagnostic that required stillness.
I sat down next to her. I do not know exactly why.
The floor was not comfortable.
My secondary skeletal structure does not make floor sitting natural.
But I sat down, and I set my log recorder on my knee, and I looked at the same wall she was looking at, which was not a wall but the back of my own eyelids because I had also, apparently, closed my eyes.
After a moment, she said, "You still recording?"
"Yes," I said.
"It is habitual at this point." A pause. "What are you going to put in the report?"
"I do not yet know," I said, which was the most honest thing I had said in 14 hours. She was quiet for a while.
I listened to the ambient sounds of the hub. The low conversations of soldiers on downtime between probes. Devi moving between the medical cases.
The faint structural vibration of the station processing its own damage. Somewhere, Ferreira was apparently still studying the Vrath weapon. I could hear the faint sound of her explaining something about firing pin geometry to Nowak, who was responding in the flat tones of someone who has agreed to listen in exchange for social peace.
"Why do you eat every 3 hours?" Adeyemi said. I looked at her.
Her eyes were still closed.
"How do you know I eat every 3 hours?" "I've been watching you," she said.
"Same as you've been watching me."
I considered this. Shalif cognitive function degrades in sustained stress environments without caloric maintenance at regular intervals, I said. The 3-hour protocol is standard Dominion field guidance. Does it work?
It works better than the alternative.
A pause.
Why do you ask?
Trying to figure out what you eat when you're not in a siege.
The faintest shift at the corner of her mouth. The meals you've been carrying look terrible.
They are, I said.
They are nutritionally complete and culinarily catastrophic. This is, I am told, a known issue with Dominion field rations.
There are memos about it.
Have the memos helped?
They have not.
The corner of her mouth shifted again, more definitively this time. Not quite what I understood as a smile, or rather, exactly what I understood as a smile, but smaller, private, the kind that wasn't performing for anyone. She still had not opened her eyes.
"We've got about 40 minutes, she said.
"Before they try the west conduit access."
"How rotation pattern?"
She turned her head slightly against the wall.
"They've been hitting us in a sequence.
East, primary breach, east again, primary breach again.
The sequence is 4. Next is west conduit. Then, they'll reset." A pause.
"Or they'll break pattern, which means something changed on their end, which means I'll know that too. They may break pattern specifically to defeat your prediction."
"They might."
She did not sound concerned.
"Then, we adapt."
The word adapt, she said it the way she said most tactical facts, flatly, informatively, without inflection, as though the word contained its own complete logic and required nothing added.
"We adapt."
As though it were a thing that simply happened, a law of physics, a given. There is a concept in Vrath military doctrine, I had reviewed it before Korath had filed it under contextual background, secondary, called Kethvar. The Vrath understanding of combat effectiveness is built on the premise that a unit's power comes from its rigidity. The strength of the formation is the irreducibility of its components. You know what each element will do because each element cannot do otherwise. The Vrath are very good at this. They execute doctrine with exceptional consistency. This is, I now understand, why they kept losing. Because every time they hit us in a new way, we were different. Not better armed. Not more numerous. Different. The way water is different from ice, same material, completely different structural response to pressure. Adeyemi opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling of the hub for a moment. You know what the worst part of this is? She said. I have several hypotheses, I said. I would rather hear yours. The coffee situation. She closed her eyes again. I had a good coffee going this morning before the attack. It was almost done. I've been thinking about it for 6 hours. I looked at her. The coffee. I know how it sounds. I am choosing not to evaluate how it sounds, I said carefully. She laughed. It was brief and quiet and entirely genuine, and it was the first time I had heard her laugh in 14 hours, and my secondary jaw produced the click I kept suppressing and I stopped suppressing it. Fair enough, she said. We sat there for another few minutes. Then, she stood up, checked her weapon, and walked back to the tactical display. I sat on the floor for another moment, listening to Ferreira explain firing pin geometry to an increasingly resigned Nowak. I finished my protein meal. 38 minutes later, the Vrath hit the West Conduit access. They came differently this time. Not the standard probe. A full push, heavy force, multiple entry points simultaneously, they had been conserving for it, building pressure while we read their rotation, and, when it hit with a weight that I felt in the floor of the hub before I heard it in the air. My threat assessment implant pulled up probability numbers and I looked at them this time. 17%. The Vrath had chosen this push because the numbers supported it. They had run their calculations. They had our ammunition expenditure from 14 hours of probing, our personnel count from their initial attack, our defensive positions from their sensor sweeps. The math said 17% survival probability for the human defenders. The Vrath were very good at math. Adeyemi had moved 6 people before the breach happened. I watched this in real time. I watched her before the push began, when my implant had not yet registered the shift in the assault pattern, but something in her head already had the faint change in her position, a slight rotation toward the West Conduit, 2 soldiers repositioned, Brennan informed, 2 more repositioned. I watched her do this with the same flat, habitual economy she brought to everything, and I thought about Nowak asking how much slower his reload would be, and I thought about Ferreira's improvised thermal sensor, and I thought about the Calypso belt story administered at exactly the right moment in the right dose like a medication. 17%. The Vrath math was probably right. For the unit they thought they were fighting. The West Conduit breach lasted 11 minutes. I am not going to reconstruct it in detail because I do not have a detail that is more important than this. At minute 4, the primary breach point also opened, and Brennan covered it, and Adeyemi was at the West Conduit and Brennan was at the primary breach, and they were communicating without communicating in the way I had been watching them communicate all day, 2 nodes in a system with no visible connection point, and the system held. At minute 9, Ose, whose chest wound should have kept him in the medical area for at minimum another 8 hours by any medical standard I was familiar with, appeared at the secondary position near the east wall. He was not in full gear. He had one arm partially immobilized. He was holding a weapon in the other. Debbie said, from the medical area, in a tone of profound professional resignation, I told you not to. I know, said Ose. You cannot, your chest, I know. He held the position for the remaining 2 minutes of the push. When the Vrath withdrew, he sat down on the nearest surface and Debbie descended on him with the specific energy of a medical professional whose instructions have been ignored and whose patient has, despite this, not died, which produced an expression that I had no direct translation for but, filed under *complicated.
The Wrath pulled back. Again. Adeyemi stood in the center of the hub. She was checking ammunition. I looked at her left boot, the one with the scuff marks, the 7 scratches and the deeper 9th, and I counted them again, which I had been doing at intervals throughout the day, and I recognized that I was doing this because my implant could not tell me what she was thinking, and the scratches were something I could count, and the counting was less disorienting than not counting. 17%. We were at hour 15. The Wrath were regrouping again. Adeyemi was counting ammunition with the air of someone arriving at a number they already knew and confirming it. Brennan was updating his tactical display with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been doing his job in terrible conditions for a long time and intends to keep doing it. Nowak was favoring his splinted arm, checking the half-second reload delay, adjusting. Ferreira was explaining something about Wrath tactical psychology to anyone who would listen, which was currently Devi, who was maintaining Osei against his will and had apparently decided that a lecture on alien cultural theory was preferable to silence. I updated my log. I noted the 17% survival probability. I noted the current time. I noted that the probability had been wrong at least 14 times already. Then, I noted, in the unofficial log, in language I would never file with the fleet, *, I do not know what these people are. I have been watching them for 15 hours and I have not found the edges of them. Every time I locate a boundary, a limit, a ceiling, a point where they should stop, they are already somewhere else. Not past the limit. They are past the concept of the limit. As if the limit was a category error from the beginning, *, I paused. Added, * the coffee she was making before the attack. She keeps mentioning it. I have been thinking about it too. I do not know what this means, * saved the entry. Outside the hub, the Wrath were regrouping for a push they believed their math supported. Inside the hub, Adeyemi was looking at the tactical display, and Kowalski was apparently recovering well enough to make a low comment that caused Nowak to produce the controlled collapse sound again, and Ferreira was still talking about firing pin geometry, and I was eating a protein meal on the floor next to the coolant relay panel with the misaligned fastener, and the hub had a smell now, a specific, human-generated smell of exertion and ozone and something warmer underneath it that I did not have a name for, that I was not going to be able to forget regardless of how this ended. The Wrath math said 17%. I looked at the hub. I thought, the Wrath math is measuring the wrong thing. I did not know yet how right I was. Once a story told in fear, now humanity commands the battlefield part 3, what the math was missing at hour 19, the Wrath stopped probing and started talking. I want to say I saw this coming. I did not see this coming. No one in the hub saw this coming. The Wrath Combine's military doctrine does not include tactical negotiation during an active siege. It is not a concept they have historically found useful, and their record on surrender protocols is one I had reviewed with considerable discomfort in the pre-assignment briefing. When the signal suppression platform went partially offline and a Wrath command frequency opened on our communications array, the first 30 seconds of the hub were characterized by a confusion that I think is worth noting because it tells you something about what everyone in that room had been prepared for. They had been prepared for another push. They had been prepared for more fighting. They had been prepared, I think, for the possibility of being overrun, in the way people prepare for things they intend to prevent. They had not been prepared for a voice. The Wrath commander identified himself as Force Director HFY. His standard was accurate and slightly archaic, the way of someone who had learned it from documentation rather than conversation. He addressed the communication to the commanding officer of the defended position. Brennan looked at Adeyemi. This is a fact I recorded and have replayed several times. Brennan was the commanding officer. Brennan had been commanding the hub for 19 hours. Brennan was a capable officer whose decisions had kept us alive. When the Wrath opened communication, Brennan looked at Adeyemi. She gave him a slight incline of her head that I translated, after watching humans for 19 hours, as, your call, he broadcast back. Confirmed his rank and role. Asked what the Force Director wanted. What HFY wanted, it emerged over the next several minutes, was to understand what had happened. Not to offer terms. Not to negotiate surrender. To understand.
The phrasing was careful, but the intent was plain. 17 Wrath soldiers had not returned from breach attempts that should, by every metric the Combine used, have succeeded. The signal suppression platform had been partially disrupted, not by any technology we possessed, it turned out, but by Ferreira's improvised thermal sensor, which had generated a feedback loop in the Wrath sensor net that their technicians had been working to correct for 8 hours and had only partially resolved. The Wrath commander wanted to know how a civilian xenosociologist with a salvaged Wrath weapon and conduit wire had disrupted a fleet-grade suppression platform. Ferreira, when this was relayed to her, said, "I didn't know that's what it did."
"You didn't know?" Nowak stared at her.
"I was making a thermal motion sensor. If it also disrupted their sensor net, that was." She paused, and something passed across her face that I had difficulty categorizing, a very fortunate systems interaction.
Nowak looked at Adeyemi. Adeyemi looked at the communications array. There was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. "Ferreira," Adeyemi said.
"Yes?" "Next time you accidentally disrupt a fleet-grade suppression platform, tell me while it's happening." "I will do that," Ferreira said, with the air of someone who has just been given advice they will sincerely attempt to apply but is not certain they will be able to recognize the relevant situation in advance. Brennan handled the communication with HFY. What emerged, over 45 minutes of a conversation I recorded in its entirety, was not a negotiation and was not a surrender and was not any category of military exchange I had been trained to document. What it was, I believe, was the Wrath Combine encountering for the first time the specific problem that the Dominion had been categorizing as manageable for 11 years. HFY asked how our position had held with the numbers we had. Brennan explained, briefly, that when a position needs to hold it holds until it can't and, then, you figure something out. HFY asked why our personnel continued fighting past the point of rational cost-benefit calculation. Brennan said he'd have to ask them, but probably because that's what you do. HFY asked, and this is the question I find most interesting in retrospect, why the human soldiers in the medical area had returned to active positions against all medical recommendation. Brennan thought about this for a moment. "Because their people needed them," he said. A pause on the Wrath side. A long one. Long enough that I noted the duration in my log, 11 seconds. "This is not a calculable return," HFY said. "No," Brennan agreed. "It's not." Another pause. "We are going to withdraw the suppression platform," HFY said. "I am filing this engagement as a resource allocation error." Brennan said, "Okay." "I want a note," he said. "Okay," 2 syllables. The Wrath commander had just announced a de facto end to a 19-hour siege that had been running, by any military assessment, in the Wrath's favor, and Brennan said okay in the tone of someone confirming a delivery time. The suppression platform went offline 3 minutes later. Dominion fleet response was in the system within the hour. Standard response protocol, the distress beacon that Ferreira's device had partially restored had done its job, eventually. In the 40 minutes between HFY's withdrawal announcement and the fleet's arrival, the hub did something I had not observed it doing in 19 hours. It rested. Not in the shallow sense of efficient recovery, scheduled downtime, optimized sleep intervals, metabolic replenishment in proper sequence. It rested in the way I had come to understand, over 19 hours of close observation, was distinctly and specifically human. Which is to say, it was loud, slightly chaotic, metabolically inefficient, and produced no useful output that I could measure. Kowalski and Nowak were arguing about something I did not follow that appeared to be a long-standing disagreement about the correct way to play a particular card game. Devi was making Ose eat something while simultaneously telling him, at some length, everything she thought about his earlier decision to return to active duty, and Ose was eating and nodding and producing sounds of agreement at intervals that suggested he had heard this category of speech from Devi before. 2 of the soldiers I had not yet learned the names of were sleeping against the east wall with complete disregard for the ambient noise level. Ferreira was writing something. On paper. Actual paper, from a small notebook she had been carrying in her suit pocket, which I had not noticed until now. She was writing quickly, cross-legged on the floor, with the particular focused absorption of someone who has accumulated something that needs to get out. I walked over to her. This was, in retrospect, probably presumptuous of me. She did not look up.
Field notes?
I asked. Memoir, she said.
While it's fresh.
She turned a page. I've been a xenosociologist for 12 years and I have never had source material like this. You are treating a siege as research data.
I am treating everything as research data.
She looked up briefly.
Isn't that what you're doing?
I looked at my log recorder.
Yes, I said.
Good. She looked back down at the notebook. Then, we both have a lot of work to do when this is over.
Adeyemi was at the viewport.
Not doing anything in particular, standing, looking at the starfield, which had not been visible for most of the last 19 hours and was now visible again through the hub's intact viewport section, the signal suppression platform no longer blocking the sensor feeds that fed the display. Her weapon was on the console next to her.
Her hands were not on it.
I walked to the viewport and stood next to her. She did not turn. The starfield through the viewport was what it always is: cold, very large, the way that makes you aware your idea of scale is optimistically small. 2 of Koratha's structural arms were visible at the edges, damaged in ways that were going to take months to repair. The Vrath ships were pulling back. I could see the drive signatures on the sensor display, not gone but no longer pressing in.
You knew they would pull back, I said. Not a question. She considered this. I thought they might. Once the suppression platform started having issues.
A pause.
The Vrath are methodical.
When the method stops working, they reassess. It usually takes them longer than it should, but they get there.
You knew this before the siege. It was in the pre-assignment brief. I thought about the pre-assignment brief. I thought about the 14 pages on Koratha's architectural history.
I thought about the coffee she'd been making when the attack started, which she'd mentioned twice and which I understood now was not really about the coffee.
What else was in the brief that you retained? I asked.
She turned from the viewport and looked at me with the direct, forward-set eyes that still, after 19 hours, produced a faint and irrational unease in the part of my nervous system that my evolutionary history had not successfully trained out of me.
All of it, she said. Why? Genuine curiosity, I said, which was true and was also the most inadequate description of what I was experiencing that I had available. She almost smiled.
You have good field instincts for a non-combatant. I have a protein meal habit and a log recorder, I said. That is approximately all I contributed. You came through the scrubber tunnels, she said.
You covered the angles I pointed you at. You didn't freeze, you didn't panic, and you didn't get in the way.
She picked up her weapon from the console.
That's more than some.
I looked at the starfield.
I followed you, I said.
I do not know that following qualifies as instinct.
Following the right person at the right time is a skill, she said. Most people can't tell the difference. The fleet arrived 43 minutes later. 2 Dominion cruisers and a medical frigate. Standard deployment, standard communication, standard extraction protocol.
I sent my preliminary report from the docking bay while they were still unloading the medical team.
The preliminary report is not this document.
The preliminary report contains exactly what happened at Korath in the sense of events, participants, timeline, outcome. It is accurate and it is complete and it contains almost nothing I actually need to say.
This is what I need to say.
I spent 19 hours watching 41 humans hold a position against odds that, on paper, did not permit holding. I spent 19 hours taking very careful notes and doing very careful analysis and arriving, at the end of it, at a conclusion I did not expect and do not entirely know what to do with. The humans won because they were better at the siege. Tactically, technically, individually, Adeyemi was better than the Vrath commander at reading a fight, Ferreira was better at improvising tools from available materials, Nowak was better at ignoring information his own body was sending him that did not serve the current objective.
This is a fact and it is in the report.
But I have been a tactical liaison officer for 17 years and I know what tactical superiority looks like, and that is not the whole picture. The whole picture requires a different word, and the word I have been reaching for since hour 2 of the siege is one that does not exist in Shaleth, and I have been constructing it in the weeks since I returned to base, building it from available material, and the closest I have come is this, Velkareth *, the state of a system that improves under the conditions designed to destroy it.
Not resilience. Resilience is returning to baseline.
Velkareth is the thing that comes out of compression stronger than it went in, not because it was built that way but because compression is simply how it works. It is not a property that can be designed or trained. It is, as best I can tell, a property that emerges from a specific relationship between a being and its own capacity for suffering, a relationship in which the suffering is metabolized rather than avoided, and the metabolization produces something that looks, from the outside, like indestructibility.
The humans were not indestructible. I watched them bleed. I watched them hurt.
I watched Nowak's face in the 3-second intervals when he thought no one was observing him and his body's information about his fractured arm was getting through. I watched Adeyemi sit down against the wall with her eyes closed and look, for 40 minutes out of 19 hours, like someone who needed 40 minutes. I watched Osei be carried in and refused to stay. They were completely destructible.
That was the point.
What they were not was stopped by the fact of their own destruction. The destruction was just something that had happened to them, an input, a data point, and they were already past it, already on the next problem, already adapting.
The Vrath built a force that could not be hurt. The humans built a force that could not be stopped. These are not the same thing.
I have included this analysis in my unofficial log because it is not appropriate for the official report.
The official report must contain facts.
What I am describing is not a fact in the way the Dominion uses that word. It is an observation about a pattern, and the pattern is one that I do not yet know how to translate into the language of strategic assessment and, I suspect, cannot be, which is part of why it matters and part of why I am releasing this now.
The Dominion has a file on humanity. I have read it.
It is thorough and well-researched and built on good data, and it arrives at the conclusion that humans are a Tier 3 military presence that represents a manageable variable in galactic dynamics.
I wrote part of that file.
3 years ago, on a posting to Human Dominion Joint Exercises, I contributed 6 sections on human tactical doctrine and individual combat performance.
I was proud of those sections. They were accurate.
They were measuring the wrong thing. In my last exchange with Adeyemi before she shipped out, standing in the Korath docking bay while the medical team processed Osei and Kowalski and the Dominion fleet ran its standard extraction protocol, I asked her the question I had been constructing for 19 hours.
Why? I said.
I have been watching you hold this position and I have all of the tactical explanation I need and none of the actual explanation. Why do you do this? She had picked up a new protein bar, a human one, from the relief supplies, something that apparently passed for an improvement over the rations she'd been eating, which based on the expression she made when she bit into it was not a high bar to clear. She was looking at it with the mild, evaluative expression she turned on most things.
Do what? She said.
This. I gestured, inadequately, at the hub behind us.
At the 19 hours of it.
At Nowak's arm and Osei coming off the medical table and Kowalski's story about the drunk navigator and Ferreira's improvised sensor that had disrupted a fleet-grade suppression platform by accident. Why do you do this?
What is the calculation? She thought about it.
She chewed the protein bar and she looked at the docking bay ceiling and she thought about it the way she thought about everything, as if the answer were a structural problem and she was looking for the load-bearing element.
There isn't one, she said, finally. Not one that makes sense as math. Then, what is it? She looked at me.
Direct, forward set, the eyes that still produced that faint unease that I had mostly stopped trying to train out of myself.
It's the people, she said. That's it. Just the people. She took another bite. Made the same mild expression about the protein bar.
You ask Osei why he got up. He'll say because Nowak was at the west breach and Nowak's arm was slowing him down and someone needed to cover the east. You ask Nowak why he was at the west breach, he'll say because Kowalski needed the medical bay and someone had to be there.
You ask Kowalski, she gestured. It's all the way down. It's all the same answer. The same answer all the way down, I said. And, the answer is the people. Yeah.
She finished the protein bar.
Folded the wrapper with the same neat efficiency she applied to everything. Pocketed it. Weird, right?
It was, I wanted to tell her, the single most disorienting piece of tactical intelligence I had ever encountered. It was a closed loop with no entry point for disruption. You could not break the chain because the chain was not a chain, it was a web, continuous, self-reinforcing, and every node was simultaneously a point of strength and a point of connection, and you could not destroy the points of connection without destroying the nodes, and the nodes would not let you. There is no doctrine for fighting something that fights because of the person next to it. The Wrath had known this, I think, at some level. That was why HFY had called. He had not called because he was losing. He had called because he needed to understand what he was losing to. I did not say any of this to Adeyemi. She would have shrugged. She would have said something dry and brief that treated everything I had just thought as obvious, as the kind of thing you notice when you are new to it, and then, she would have looked for the next problem to solve. So I said, instead, I hope your next posting has better coffee. She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, genuine, private, the kind of expression that was not performing for anyone. Yeah, she said. Me too. She picked up her kit. She walked toward the transport. I stood in the docking bay and I finished my protein meal and I looked at the stars through the bay's outer viewport and I thought about the word I had made, Velkareth, the thing that improves under pressure. I thought about how long I had been looking for the edges of these people and had not found them. I thought about the misaligned fastener on the coolant relay panel. The ninth scratch on Adeyemi's boot, deeper than the others. Nowak's half-second reload delay. Ferreira's notebook. Osei getting up. I thought about HFY's 11-second silence after Brennan said because their people needed them, the fleet would file this as a successful defense of a strategic asset. That is what it was and that is what the report says. In my unofficial log, I filed it differently. I filed it as the day I stopped thinking the word manageable applied to anything I had witnessed at Korath Station. The day I started updating the file. They are out there, in the galaxy, in their ships and their stations and their postings, eating protein bars that taste like compressed regret, memorizing architectural histories they might need in a tunnel, telling stories about drunk navigators at exactly the right moment in exactly the right dose. The stories we tell about them, in the briefing files and the strategic assessments and the tier classifications, those are the stories that were told in fear. Fear of acknowledging what they are. Fear of the calculation that follows. They know what they are. They just shrug about it. That is, I have come to believe, the most frightening part.